My name is James Peterson. I'm the host of Evening Words on WURD Radio in Philadelphia. And Kirstin, thank you and the team at URL for organizing. This is important that we continue to talk and be in community together during these times.
And hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Eileen. I'm the immigration enforcement reporter at Documented, an online nonprofit newsroom serving immigrant New Yorkers here in New York City. And I'm really excited to be chatting with all these other amazing journalists doing good work.
Hi, I'm Mariah Castañeda. I am the audience director and co-founder of LA Public Press. We are a newsroom for LA people by LA people. And yeah, it's just my job to make sure that our news is relevant and informative for the people of Los Angeles.
And again, these are all independently run newsrooms across the country. So if you're looking for a place to get information, especially in a time like now where we are seeing mainstream media change how they're consuming and operating with news, these are some great outlets to start following. Andrew, I'm going to start with you because, as I kind of said at the top, Minneapolis has been, for lack of better words, ground zero lately for a major ICE activity, and in a place that I think many people were like, Minnesota, like, it wasn't a place I think people thought they would see immigration enforcement. I know your team at Sahan Journal was right there as soon as Renee Good was shot earlier this year, within minutes, really. Talk to me about what has it been like? What have you guys noticed? And just how has your team been trying to cover this story that developed so quickly?
It's been very hectic here and intense. I think those are good words for it. There's so much happening every single day, and it's been a lot, I think, for our team to try to pick and choose which stories to try and attack, like triage out what to focus on, when to focus on what, who to speak to, who to try and reach, how much to be out following ICE and Border Patrol as they've been kind of roving around our city. And we've been trying to do our best to do a little bit of everything. There's been so many agents out here, and I think that's what makes this in particular enforcement surge very different here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is that, the Twin Cities, we're not a huge major metro area. We are not New York or LA or Chicago. But, when the Trump administration did their surge in Chicago, they sent about 400 to 500 extra agents. At the height here in Operation Metro Surge in the Twin Cities, there were over 3,000 additional agents moving around Minneapolis, St. Paul, and our surrounding suburbs. So the scale of that compared to the size of our immigrant communities here is largely out of whack. And, especially considering we have major immigrant communities here who are refugees, who are almost all U.S. citizens and or green card holders, who are, totally clear legal immigrants, but they've still been being racially profiled, wrongfully arrested, persecuted out in the street. So we've been trying to document as much of that as possible. Since the shooting of Alex Preddy on January 24th, I think we have seen, at least in rhetoric, a attempt to withdraw back a little bit from the White House and from the Trump administration, swapping out some personnel. And they have been withdrawing some of the agents that were here in Minneapolis, St. Paul. We believe that they have pulled out about 1,700 agents, but that still leaves a lot of extra agents on the ground here in the Twin Cities. And what we've noticed in the last week or two, I would say, is that this is spreading out more to our suburban areas instead of being focused in the core of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there are still people being arrested every single day. There are still groups of ICE agents knocking on doors, stopping people at bus stops, stopping people, boxing them in as they're driving to work. That is still happening all across the metro constantly every day. And so we've been trying to adjust our coverage to how they've been adjusting their tactics and where they are and just being a little more spread out. But it's really a great reminder of how many immigrants there are in this country, how many immigrants there are here in the Twin Cities metro. And I hear people bring up, towns or suburbs where they say, "Oh, I didn't realize that there was, a big community from Honduras there, or a big community from Mexico or Ecuador there." And, people are all spread out, and a lot of these people are still living in a great deal of fear and anxiety, and justifiably so.
Yeah. And speaking to that, I know we saw the community truly, really react, whether it was, I feel like the sense of like mutual aid, people helping their neighbors who couldn't get out because they're fearful for their safety, but also, I mean, widespread protests, truly. I mean, and in frigid temperatures, people were taking to the streets. Talk to me about the reaction with the protests. I mean, what was it like seeing hundreds, thousands of people take to the streets after these shootings?
I think it was really powerful. To see just not only in these mass protests, like yes, of course, after the shooting of Renee Good and after the shooting of Alex Petty, we saw these massive marches. And January in Minnesota, it's very cold here. There were days where -20 degrees outside and thousands of people still going out and marching in the streets because it was that important to them to signal, that they thought this was wrong. But there are also these, smaller scale protests. I don't even know if protest is the right word exactly, but like micro scale protests and or observational protests, really just people documenting what's happening, people going out, patrolling around their neighborhoods on foot in the winter, looking out for immigration enforcement activity, trying to signal to neighbors if they see ICE agents or Border Patrol agents in their neighborhoods, hey, if you're worried at all about your status or worried at all about being racially profiled, which we've seen happen a lot here, trying to alert people and have them stay inside. And there's all sorts of levels to resistance and protest here. As you mentioned, huge demonstrations in downtown Minneapolis, at federal buildings throughout the Twin Cities, throughout this process. But I think what's really inspiring or something that can give people a sense of solidarity and hope is the amount of people who have been going out in these individual ways when they hear about ICE coming in their neighborhood, trying to let people know this is happening. When you have people who are volunteering to walk their neighbors' kids to the bus stop, because we've seen people get picked up with their kids at the bus stop. We see people dropping off groceries for people, organizing through churches. My kid goes to a Spanish immersion daycare here in Minneapolis, and parents giving rides to the teachers, parents patrolling, community members kind of patrolling outside of these daycares and at our public schools morning and night. And so that sort of small scale but really involved level of community protest and really, support, I think is the best word for it. I think a lot of people have been motivated to get out there and support each other as much as they can. And it's both really heartbreaking to see that that is necessary and also very encouraging to see that people are motivated to do that.
And staying in Minneapolis, but kind of zooming out, I want to bring in Dr. James Peterson. I know while you're based in Philadelphia, and so far, Philly hasn't, experienced any ICE, any immigration activity formally, at least as far as we know. You took a really interesting zoom out at what happened in Minnesota. And obviously, you've been following what happened with two of our colleagues, independent journalists, Don Lemon and Georgia Fort, were arrested for covering a protest that happened at a church after some of these shootings. And just talk to me about what are your thoughts on how this immigration enforcement activity has kind of broadened out, that we're seeing journalists get arrested for doing their job, but also even activists like Nakima Levy Armstrong getting arrested when she was there as a faith leader, as a community leader in that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us at WRD, we always wanted to broaden out. ICE has been in Philadelphia for some time. Parity Law did pass away in custody in the Philadelphia Immigration Detention Center. I do want to get to this a little bit later, but the federal government has bought two huge warehouses in Schuylkill County and Berks County. And I'm trying to alert our listeners, like, hey, I don't know who you think is going to go in there, but you better just assume it's you, right? They're buying these detention centers for a reason. Anyway, I do want to thank Andrew and Eileen, who have both been on my show to help broaden out the conversation. Mariah, I hope we can get you on soon as well. But two of our colleagues, thanks to URL, Kirstin, right? Andrew and Eileen have both been on to talk to our listeners. I don't mean any disrespect to Don Lemon or to Georgia Fort at all here, Kirstin. You know that. But let me set the stage. We had an opportunity to interview Nakima Levi Armstrong, who is the attorney who organized the protest action at I forget the name of the church. Andrew will tell me the name of the church. at the church that organizers had identified had a associate pastor who was an administrator for ICE there in St. Paul's. And they came into that demonstration. They were peaceful. They worshipped with the congregants initially, but then they staged an action that was very disruptive, but it was not violent, and essentially calling that church to account for you're a Christian institution and you have an ICE leader in your leadership, and look what's happening. Look at all the unchristian things happening in our communities right now. A legitimate peaceful protest. We interviewed Ms. Armstrong, who's an attorney, a mother, and an activist and organizer. We interviewed her. It was an incredible interview on WRD. That night or early the next morning, 50 federal agents stormed her home. They had tried to negotiate an opportunity to give themselves in. They were willing to turn themselves in once the DOJ turned its focus on. They were willing to turn themselves. 50 federal agents stormed their home, kidnapped them, took them out of there, arrested her and detained her, right? All the things. Now, she was ultimately released and she's fighting, imagine having to fight the force of the federal government over a peaceful protest action. But what's been frustrating with to me a little bit about this, Kirstin, is that they're covering Don Lemon, they're covering George Fort, who were the journalists who were covering what Nekima Levi Armstrong was doing. And again, I don't mean any disrespect to the journalists we cover. I'm a journalist. We're all journalists. We have to cover things. It's important, but we're missing the story, to me, because we're not saying Nekima's name when we say Don Lemon, when we say Georgia Fort. And I know there are other folks caught up in this DOJ dragnet, and we've got to be able to talk about them because people are going to be disappeared in this kind of context. I'm sorry, Don Lemon's not going to get disappeared. And Don Lemon's pockets are probably quite a bit deeper than Nekima Levi Armstrong's pockets are. And so that was a little bit of the frustration for me around that, Kirstin. I mean, it was incredible that we had an opportunity to talk with her before the federal government rained down on her and her family and her children in such an awful and terroristic way. But it's been frustrating to see the coverage of it because she's the one who needs the legal defense support. She's the one who needs the support. And I support Don Lemon. I support Georgia Fort, and I hope they continue to speak out against it. But there are people who have remained nameless in this, including Miss Armstrong, who was the actual organizer and activist leader of the action that caused the firestorm in the first place.
And staying on that, because you're right, there are so many people who have been affected by this. And I know even the day that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were arrested, there were other Black activists who were arrested that day as well. And, looking back at this, what does that say that there are people who were peacefully protesting, using their First Amendment right to peacefully protest, and they're getting caught up with not just, as you said, not one or two agents coming to their door, but 50 agents coming to their door. What does that say about this escalation of enforcement we're seeing from the federal government to people who are average citizens?
It says that our federal government is completely committed to the use and deployment of fascist tactics to police, detain, and terrorize its own people, to police and terrorize its own neighborhoods, its own cities, residents or citizens or not. When we wrote about and talked about Renee Nicole Good, I think it's important for folks to understand that a lot of folks in the Black community are like, hey, if they'll shoot a white woman in the face like that, what are they going to do to us? What I said to my listeners, it's legitimate for you to say that. But I always also say, I couch these things a little bit like, if it matters to you that she's an American citizen or not, right? Because there's too much, in my opinion, there is too much anti-immigrant sentiment that has been seeded and continues to grow in communities of color. Not that it hasn't been there before, but it has been cultivated in what I think are some algorithmic and really, I say seedy, but really just sinister ways. And I'm trying to disabuse my listeners of that. And so I think what we're seeing and what's happening in Minnesota and other places around the country, it shows us what this government is about. This government does not mind deploying fascist tactics to police, detain, and terrorize the people in our communities. And I think as journalists, we have to continue to to monitor that. I love the work that Eileen does because I'm always like talking stuff, like I'm always mad, and Eileen is like, here's some solutions, folks. Here's some resources. You got to know your rights. You have to know certain things, and that's again, shout out to URL because I'm learning and helping my audience learn through the extraordinary research sources of this media network. And I didn't know this in the beginning when I first came on WRD or understanding what URL's mission was, but there's a premium value in what we're doing right now in terms of educating and edifying our communities against this kind of autocratic encroachment. And so I think we need to be clear-eyed about the government we have, not the government we want to have, not the government we thought we had, not the government that some folks thought they were voting for in November 2024, right? This is the government that we have. You can watch and see what they're doing. There are enough journalists still, out here telling the truth. But I'm telling you, when you see what happened to Colbert earlier this week, FCC lawyers saying you can't interview a rising Democratic candidate, them changing the rules to fit the game they want to play. They do not mind using the tactics and strategies of fascists. I'm not exaggerating. Just look at the history of fascism to control, to indoctrinate, to detain, and terrorize the people in our neighborhoods and our communities.
Yeah. And you talked about resources, and actually, this is a perfect segue to Mariah, because I know over at the LA Public Press, LA and New York, both, coast to coast, those two cities were very much the beginning of a lot of that extreme and increased immigration enforcement last year. And Mariah, I know your newsroom created a resource for immigrant neighborhoods because, as many of us can imagine, we're in the communities, we know these neighborhoods, but anytime that national news comes in, there is this parachute effect of dozens and dozens of reporters who may not know the community well, who are now in these communities. And in this case, this is a story where there is a language barrier. There isn't always a clear understanding of what it means to talk to a reporter, and especially a reporter you may not know. Mariah, really tell me about the inspiration before a resource guide that you all created, and then even the reaction to that resource guide in your community, but also beyond.
Yeah, I really want to zoom out just a little bit real fast. State violence against immigrant communities is in LA and the rest of the country, but definitely in LA, it's nothing new. Exactly 1 week from today is the 95th anniversary of the La Placita raid that happened in Los Angeles 95 years ago. 400 people, Mexicanos and people of Mexican descent, were rounded up in Placita Olvera, about 4 miles away from where I'm sitting today, were rounded up and detained during the Great Depression. We've seen these mass deportation campaigns happen in the past. I can go on, but we're not going to do that today. A lot of times what we've done historically is spread print materials in our Spanish-speaking newspapers and amongst community activists to educate our communities, to teach our communities how to stay safe during multiple campaigns that have attacked our communities, whether it's mass sterilization raids, whether it's our teachers hitting kids who are speaking Spanish in class, right? So during this recent mass deportation campaign that we saw, and that really started in Los Angeles on June 6th with the Ambience Apparel raid that led to 40 people getting detained, really setting a precedent for the rest of the country, is we noticed that we saw reporters from these legacy outlets that had traditionally neglected our communities, traditionally not reported on our communities. And then we also saw international media even coming out to these communities, which, I think is great. Everybody needs to know about these offenses to our communities. Everyone needs to know these need to be reaching as far and wide as possible. But our communities who had been historically neglected, historically not really reported on, did not have really know how to speak to reporters. They weren't used to that. So you suddenly have reporters coming in from different places. People don't know what background means. People don't know what off the record means. People are just saying like, oh my God, I saw this and that happen, giving their full names. Not knowing that they can ask reporters how much information is going to be published about them. So I thought about it, and my engagement producer, Amanda, thought about it. Our engagement producer, Amanda, came to me and said, like, Mariah, some of my sources don't want to talk to me right now because another reporter at another newsroom put out someone's full name and I think something like their location or some other information. And it made them not want to talk to press at all. And I was like, wow, okay, you know what? That makes sense. I too would feel scared. You know what? I've been media trained. I think most folks in media either have been media trained or know how to speak to media because we're in media, right? What if we make a media training guide that's for everybody and not just for immigrant communities? Everybody now who's under this new fascist administration can know how to speak to reporters. So Amanda and I got to work. We started making this bilingual guide. We had it translated. Then we distilled the highlights onto a card and we made it a green card. In LA, the hot card was the red card. We're like, we're gonna make a green card so people know that's for like how to talk to media outlets. We spread the word. We put out a video. Um, Thank you so much, Eileen. Yeah, we put out a video explaining it. We made it printable so anybody can go print it out. All you got to do is fold it and cut it. Super simple, super easy. Yeah, we distributed it at the time, but we're the most heavily impacted communities. We distributed it in Southeast LA and South LA. And yes, of course, people could print it out on our website in English and Spanish. And it was a guide that was really well received, both by the communities in LA that were like, wow, this is so cool. This is really helpful to me, and also by the larger journalism community who thought it was like a brand new thing. But for us, we were like, we weren't even really thinking about it being new or anything. We were just kind of thinking like, oh my God, what do they need? I think like the rest of LA County, we were really building the plane as we were flying it. So I'm really grateful we can make that guide. We also made another guide called How to Navigate Living in an ICE Occupied Community. That one we've seen printed all over. Different people have been printing it out. We've been distributing it. We had a little zine making party where we had to close RSVPs because so many people wanted to come out and help us assemble these zines. So yeah, I'll just stop right there.
No, and I think that is really helpful because it's a newsroom responding to the moment. And I think that's the beauty of the newsrooms that you all represent, is that you've been in the community. As you mentioned, this is not new. You've been covering these communities, you know the different nuances. And for a lot of us, these are our communities. Like, we live in these communities too. So there's a different personal connection. I know, Mariah, I also want to talk about, just as you mentioned, LA really was, again, this is nothing new for LA, but last year, that was the first city that I feel like everyone started watching what was happening. What was it like being the first city that really had that initial increased enforcement from the Trump administration? And just how has it been since? Because even though the national cameras have left, I know, things are still happening in the community. Just what are things looking like right now?
Yeah, so the national cameras might have left, but you know what? Us and our local partners, our local newsrooms, we're not going away. We're not going anywhere, and our communities know that. Yeah, I would say it's been relentless. Ever since that first ambient apparel raid on June 6th, it's been relentless. I must say, I was just coming back from a news conference in Minnesota, and then the day after was then when this raid started. Um, yeah, we see raids everywhere. Car washes, Home Depots, food stands. We saw citizens getting swept up in ICE raids for me the first time, for disappeared essentially for dozens of hours. Their loved ones could not reach them. Um, was wild. It was wild to see people that I know personally going live on Instagram, documenting raids in their communities, seeing federal agents charging at community members in their cars, and watching people I know get tear gassed on Instagram Live. Last October, Carlitos Ricardo Parillas was a TikToker who's a live streamer, was shot in the arm by federal agents. And we knew that this federal aggression was just the beginning. We saw over 8,000 people apprehended in just 3 months. I think, like, again, we were just trying to respond and trying to create a plan as we were also diving in. We saw this unprecedented attack on the press that had just been building up over the years. And it was attack on the press and attack on protesters at the time. One of our contributors was hit by a less lethal munition. And a lot of my colleagues were also hit by less lethals, tear gas, and pepper balls. I myself was tear gassed when I was co-reporting with Michelle Zacarias over at Galo News. We were also having to run away from from local law enforcement on horseback during the No Kings protest when I was on the ground reporting, doing my job. I think it was overwhelming. It was scary. And mostly it was heartbreaking. Um, the the How to Navigate Living in an ICE-Occupied Community zine actually came because somebody on my staff, her mother was stopped by ICE agents. And then 2 weeks later, that same staffer whose mother was stopped was driving the same car that her mother was stopped in. And then she was stopped and stalked by ICE agents. She was terrified. So we had to get her resources for that. But because she was dealing with that, we also worked together with her and with other members of our team to put together that zine. And we've seen it printed, we've seen it recreated. Our neighbors in Orange County also, they used it as a template and put their own resources in it, which I'm very happy has happened. We've sent it to people all over the country so they can, use the layout and also put their own resources in it. I think right now is the time to work together and build community of people across different cities because we cannot go at this by ourselves. So yeah, it's very heartbreaking. I love the people of Los Angeles. This is my home. This is where I'm from, and they deserve news that's going to serve them. So we do our best to document what's happening and providing helpful coverage and also providing coverage that celebrates the resistance and the resilience of our communities.
Yeah. And that is, I feel like, what we've seen from coast to coast, because I know Eileen in New York City, Documented has done some great coverage of just how neighbors, people in New York have said, wait a minute, hold on, like we're here. Talk to me about some of that resistance you've seen in New York City, and even just, I talked about it earlier, but the mutual aid even that has developed. How are neighbors saying, hey, these are our neighbors, we are standing up to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's amazing to hear kind of from everyone's experiences all over the country right now. I think all of you have experienced, what me and Dr. Peterson are kind of just like waiting to potentially see ourselves. And I think that that's also what's happening, with these folks who are kind of organizing in New York right now to help people who currently are being targeted by immigration enforcement, but also just kind of preparing for the worst, right? Kind of rallying the troops in a sense to fight the other army that might at our door. I think, when I was looking at the different ways that folks have helped here, definitely those rapid response networks are growing. I went to a training a couple months ago in December that had like over 1,300 people present or signed up. Lines were snaking around the building to sign up to know what they could do. And so similarly, I kind of wrote a story that was also kind of a way to point people to like how they could also help, right? So they can join these rapid response networks. They can, one thing that we hear, from our immigrant readership is that like, beyond kind of the worries of ICE, people right now are just like, we need food, we need clothes, we need, basic necessities, as kind of all of these doors are closing on folks' ability to kind of access, state and federal resources out of fear of being put on the radar of ICE, right? So, just basic things like food kitchens, volunteering to help folks in your own block. We see like lawyers organizing across the city to build networks to be able to file habeas petitions, within 24 hours before folks are shipped out to Texas or to Louisiana, or what have you. Building networks beyond that so that then they can talk to lawyers in other states. I think, right now everyone is really rallying to protect their neighbors, in the current state of things, which is not great here, even though, we haven't had a quote unquote surge. There are neighborhoods that have been very heavily hit by ICE activity in the city right now. So I think, all of these efforts have, as others have said, have been very like kind of inspiring and buoying to see like, people just, being willing to step out and put their neck on the line to help folks out.
Yeah. And a lot of this is in response to obviously all the activity, but I know in New York City, your team did some great work diving into the numbers. And I think that helps put things into perspective for a lot of people too. It's not just a feeling thing. Like I feel like there's a lot of enforcement. You all did some digging into data and found that, ICE arrests on the streets increased by 212%. I mean, that is just a huge number. I mean, talk to me about, kind of break down those numbers and just add some context to that. I mean, that is just a huge jump over 1 year.
Yeah, I think essentially what we did is we looked at, we compared, the time before Trump to the months since, his latest administration. We saw that arrests that didn't come out of jails, et cetera, jumped over 212%. Many of those arrests here in New York City, as many have seen on the headlines, have began kind of in places like immigration court at 26 Federal Plaza, where all those horrific images were coming out of the hallways. I just left there this morning. All those horrific images of like really kind of brutal arrests that were happening in the hallways of immigration court. But one thing that we've been really trying to cover outside of that is like, what does it look like in our communities? What does it look like in the streets, right? And certainly, as I noted, there are communities in Queens and Brooklyn and in the Bronx and even in Staten Island, that have been seeing really heavy ICE activity. Particularly, I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, and there's been constant presence in there. So, what we saw in those numbers, that 212% is kind of a reflection of an overall national trend nationwide, based on dating by the deportation data, like space, everyone knows this except for me in this moment, but Data Deportation Project. Essentially nationwide, they found that arrests by ICE quadrupled during the last month of available data compared to an average month in the last half of 2024. And they also saw that when you look at comparing the month before Trump's inauguration to the last month of available data, that arrests of people without any criminal convictions also went up by a factor of 7. I remember back in I used to also cover local immigration enforcement and policing in Houston, and it was we took a look at jail data and found that U.S. citizens were, I think it is 3 times more likely to be arrested for a crime. And so like we're always trying to like use these numbers to dispel kind of myths and rhetoric about what's happening on the ground. But yeah, that 212 number was pretty stark, and hopefully it doesn't get bigger.
And this is for everyone. I want to zoom out and thank you for everyone for kind of giving us a look at from literally coast to coast to, what's happening in Minnesota, to even broadening out the national implications of all these different activities. What are the immigration storylines you're following now? Because as Andrew mentioned, ICE is kind of drawing down their presence in Minnesota, but they're still there. I know I'm in Washington, D.C. We still see the National Guard and other folks. There's still a lot of federal presence in a lot of American cities. Just what are some of the immigration policies you're watching? What are the ones that you're kind of like, oh, this could change very quickly? And I'll let anyone kind of take a stab at that first.
Well, I can jump in here. We're following the federal government's acquisition of these warehouse facilities locally and nationally, and trying to give a little bit of a platform to those companies that are declining from selling these warehouses to the federal government. We are also following stories locally in Philadelphia around the community response and reaction to ICE, and so we covered the introduction of what's called ICE out legislation in Philadelphia, where local city council legislators have introduced rules for how ICE can enter into the city that the DA has signed off on, and I assume ultimately the mayor will sign off on. So what we try to do is, obviously we're hyper local, but we do want, this is a national and international issue, and we have to maintain some kind of balance in order, I think, to best address it. So that's just a couple of things that we're following. I hope that I'm able to transition over the next couple of months, though, to think about how this kind of tactical show of force and the rhetoric behind it, I think, is going to be rolled up into some kind of on the ground impact at the voting booth, right? And so I'm trying to be mindful of exactly how this administration is signaling those things, so that we can continue to keep our eyes open about whether or not we're going to have federal agents at our primaries or federal agents at the voting booth later on this year.
I think one thing that I'm really looking out for, and what I've been writing about in the last couple of weeks, is sort of the expansion of who's considered a target for for ICE or for Border Patrol. And they use the term target in an extraordinarily vague way, an almost comically vague way of saying, like, well, we go out specifically looking for specific people, but if on the way we see 8 other people who look vaguely Latino, maybe we'll also demand their proof of residence eligibility, ask for their papers on the way there. And I wrote about last week, I interviewed a man here in the Twin Cities with a pending visa application, with an active work permit. ICE had been coming to his home repeatedly. He has no criminal history here. He's not quote unquote illegal. And what we've seen in the last couple months is the Trump administration, and we've seen it for longer in immigration court, for the record, but now publicly the last couple months saying outright that all these people with pending status are illegal. In their eyes, these people are illegal, and these people are eligible to be detained for the entirety of their immigration case. Now, this, of course, is a way to get people to give up and agree to be deported. Now, when they even agree to do that, sometimes it's taking months to actually have these people be sent back to their country of origin, and that's another matter. But they're rotting in these horrific detention centers even after they agree to do it. But there are thousands of people, nationwide, hundreds and hundreds of people here in Minnesota who are not quote unquote illegal or quote unquote undocumented, to use those terms. They are people who are following a process, who are having the rules changed on them in real time, and are being told, well, hey, just because you have permission to work in this country through 2029, you're actually still here illegally. Well, how are you legally here able to work in this country if you're not legally able to reside in this country? And so that sort of expansion of targets is really what we're trying to focus on here. And that includes people with very legitimate pending refugee cases. There is an operation here called Operation Paris that has been restrained in the court, where we've spoken to people who came to this country as refugees who were following that legitimate process, who were detained and suddenly re-interviewed for no ostensive reason, brought down to Texas often or Louisiana to be grilled, and then let go, literally let go and deposited out on the streets outside of these detention centers. So that's one thing that we're really trying to focus on, is the expansion of targets for immigration enforcement.
And Eileen, I see you've gotten on mute. Do you want to add something to this?
Oh, Andrew took the words right out of my mouth. I think it's just like, both the expansion of who is a target for enforcement and the closing of the doors on people who once would have had a claim to status here in the States. We've been covering a lot of, the decisions coming down, that have been closing all these doors. For instance, like Yemen and TPS happened last Friday, but like for them, that's just the latest decision to close one more door that would have made people, able to, adjust their status, et cetera. And also all of the court cases, right, that are fighting these, that are fighting kind of these policies. One example of that was, again, TPS, which is a temporary protective status, which is a humanitarian status, that was created by Congress, that has protected thousands and thousands of people from really terrible country conditions back home, people who've been here for decades, right? And who have lived here for like 2 decades or more, have kids, have homes and businesses, and then suddenly are finding themselves a target of the administration. These are folks that have essentially, like, as I, here in the city, are essentially New Yorkers at this point, right? It's so we've been looking at that again, also the expansion of detention and kind of what that means for our city, and just changes in tactics, kind of looking at in New York City. We've been taking a look at recently just kind of at how are agents acting on the street, like you were saying, Andrew, essentially, what does it look like, in the community right now? How can our community members protect themselves and understand policing and understand, what, rights they don't and don't have, and, where their resources can be, if they find themselves in this position. We're working on a guide to tell also neighbors how they can help someone. So both for, folks who might be a target themselves, how can they best be prepared? Also, how can neighbors best be prepared to support those people? So these are all kinds of the things that we're thinking about. But as I think it was Andrew said, lots going on.
Yeah, no, this is obviously a story that is constantly developing, but also developing in different ways depending on where you live. And I actually want to read a comment that we just got in the Q&A section, directed to Mariah. So obviously a thank you for the resources and a possible suggestion. Obviously, your resource guide from the LA Public Press talks about how to interact with reporters. This comment talks about even how to protect yourself and explanations about photography. And we know as journalists that, yeah, if you're in a public place, there's 9 times out of 10, you will end up in some kind of footage of whatnot. But obviously, there's something that people need to be aware of as well, as being in these public spaces, even if you're observing or participating in a protest. You may be caught on camera, and that may or may not, that could lead to some consequences unintentionally because of the environment that we're in. I also want to just remind folks we have about less than, almost coming up, 10 more minutes left. So if there are questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A section, because it is a great opportunity to have these reporters with us. Mariah, I do want to actually point a question to you. I want to get a sense of what has been the reaction? I guess, again, I think of Los Angeles, you all really were that first big city. And, we're coming into the second year of Trump's second term in office. What are you watching in terms of even how naturalized citizens could be affected by this? Because I think that's the big concern. Anecdotally, I'm sure people have heard things, but I wonder, folks who have gone through the process, they have been naturalized as citizens, but again, our skin color doesn't change. Someone's perception of us doesn't change. What have you heard? Are you guys diving into that? I guess what concerns may there be from folks who have, quote unquote, followed the process and become citizens right now in this heightened environment?
Yeah, it's actually pretty terrifying. We actually know someone who was a born citizen who was apprehended and disappeared for 72 hours. Somebody who we would say leans more conservative, just happened to be walking in the city of Bell during a raid, was almost hit by a car that was being driven by federal agents. Just like everyone else in LA who's walking and almost gets hit by a car, you smack the hood of the car because, that's just how we are in LA, and you keep walking. I don't think he realized he hit the hood of a car that's being driven by federal agents. It was an undercover federal agent car. About a dozen agents jumped on him, dragged him, and he was taken into custody. His family cannot locate him for 72 hours. And unfortunately, we're seeing more and more cases of this, both the people who were naturalized and people who were here and were born here. I think it doesn't really matter if you look Latino. And by the way, in Los Angeles, it is 50% Latino over here. Um, it's truly, truly terrifying. I would like, if it's okay, to talk to a couple of trends that I've noticed that I'm interested in. And I speak a lot to a local. I think there's a couple things. Impacted communities, as other folks have said here, impacted communities still have bills to pay. We still have car notes, rents, all sorts of things. And night markets and markets across LA have gone pretty quiet. But still, these street vendors, car washers still need to make their money to pay their bills. So we're actually seeing new and innovative ways that people are resisting and are still trying to support their families. So organizers here in El Serrano, which is a community in East Los Angeles, have noticed that agents tend to pick people who are by themselves. So they decided, they decided to encourage communities and local communities to come out and pack our weekly night market as a way of deterring federal agents and as a way, not 100% safe, but to have safety as a number. So this night market was closed for 3 weeks straight, and then it reopened, and I went. I've never seen it so crowded, shoulder to shoulder. I could not move really because there was that many people there. All the vendors sold out, I believe, for the most part. I think most of them sold out. There was a tamborazo band. So it's really this resistance and joy, having people come out, having people, buy all these delicious items, party, listen to the music, listen to the DJs. I'm starting to see this kind of resistance being embedded into the fabric of LA. Even if you go to a coffee shop, it's going to say ice out of San Gabriel Valley, ice out of San Fernando Valley, ice out of LA. Even places where you wouldn't really expect that. You'll be going to a nice little bakery somewhere, and it's going to say ice out of LA. I think the city is being politicized in a way that it has not been politicized before. I think people are activated and they're ready to protect their neighbors. I think we're starting to see more participation at the local level. So in those smaller cities in LA County, we're seeing people show up to City Hall, to their city halls, and demand their leaders to protect them. I'm really interested to see how the elections look later on this year. The other thing I wanted to flag is we saw ice in Milan for the Winter Olympics, right? And there was outrage all over the world and here in LA too, because the 2028 games will be here in 2 short years. So I'm really interested to see, we will still be under the Trump administration during this time. And so, yeah, I'm interested in seeing how that plays out, how community members demand safety from their leaders.
And as we wrap up, I kind of want to ask everyone this as we kind of close here. Immigration will likely be a major focus of this year's election. Dr. Peterson kind of touched on it. It may be a literal physical presence in some places, but I expect candidates across the political spectrum will talk about immigration. And Mariah, you touched on it. People are becoming more engaged locally. How are our lawmakers protecting us or not? What are you all watching in terms of as we head toward this, what will likely be a heated midterm election? What are some of the immigration through lines you're following? What are some things that you maybe are asking questions of your own local or statewide officials when it comes to this topic of immigration that affects all of our communities, but also nationally as a whole? And Mariah, feel free to start us off here.
Yeah, I mean, definitely interested in birthright citizenship, definitely interested in seeing how how our leaders are going to protect us from that, right? I'm also really interested in what I've seen a trend in Los Angeles is in people seeking dual citizenship from their places of origin because people are so afraid of state violence here. They want to be able to get dual citizenship in the countries of their parents' birthplace. So I'm interested in seeing how that plays out as well.
And I should add, you touched on birthright citizenship. The US Supreme Court is expected to take up that issue, the validity of birthright citizenship this term. So by this summer, we could see how that protection is changed or dramatically turned upside down. So that is something obviously we'll be watching. And we may have to do a summer version of this because obviously that would be a huge change to the US Constitution. But Andrew, I'll have you go next.
What I'm going to be looking out for here, like in Minnesota, our state legislative session just began or is beginning today, and what I'm looking for is what's going to happen with relief. Others have touched on this, but there are thousands of families who have really not left their homes in about 2 months here. There are people who are relying entirely on the goodwill of friends and neighbors and congregation members to drop off groceries. And a lot of workplaces have cut back hours, have cut back shifts, and people have been out of work. And so there's several talked about efforts to put in funding support for people who have not been able to do this, to have an eviction moratorium in place so that people who have not been able to go out and make money as they're usually able to are not being kicked out of their homes at a time when they're super vulnerable. And so what's going to happen with that? What does that package look like? How does it come together here in Minnesota locally? And then also, like, what are the limits of state and local government power against the federal government? And that's something that we're running into repeatedly here with legal challenges. Attorney General Keith Ellison, local county attorneys, and Governor Walz and Mayor Callie Hurd in St. Paul and Jacob Pratt in Minneapolis, have all launched legal challenges to this occupation here by federal immigration authorities. That they're not really winning in these cases so far, and so I think it's gonna really be indicative of what can, I think, always, like, local and state governments can do more and should be asked to do more by their constituents, and that's their prerogative. But, like, what are the limits of that? And unfortunately, I think we're kind of seeing it in real time here.
And then Eileen, why not? And then we'll close out with Dr. Peterson.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm looking at is similarly just at, well, first off, all of the efforts that are being made both on a local and a national or a state level to plug the holes, so to speak, on what Mayor Mamdani here has called Trump proofing New York City. I've been, reporting on like how that's been going and essentially like whether that's going to work or not, right? Ultimately, how much can we protect our own city against efforts by the federal government to get information on folks who live here, get past our sanctuary laws essentially. And on top of that, something really interesting that happened here that I've been kind of watching for kind of just long term is in the 2024 presidential election, Donald Trump actually flipped quite a few districts in some of our most highly immigrant neighborhoods in New York City. It was very interesting. They moved towards Trump, started leaning in that direction. And those same areas, fascinatingly, in our most in Queens along Roosevelt Avenue, that's very hyper local, but essentially like in Queens and in highly immigrant neighborhoods, then flipped again to vote for Mamdani. And what many people told us was because that he was running on this platform of affordability, of being able to get food, kind of what we've kind of been talking about, right? Like essentially, can I pay my rent? How do I, get help getting stuff to eat, et cetera. And so I'm really curious kind of like how that's going to kind of play out long term and how those kinds of messages are going to play out, even in the, in future presidential elections here locally.
And the good doctor, we'll have you. You're the host of Evening Words, so give us some afternoon words to take us out. Oh, and you're on mute.
Ditto to all of my brilliant colleagues here. Thanks everybody for tuning into this. I really hope, and I'm going to do some programming around this, and Kirstin, I'll probably write about this ultimately too. I really hope that people will pay attention to the history of birthright citizenship, the purpose of it, and I think to what Mariah is thinking about here, which is how it makes this nation what it is today, right? And so I just hope people really pay attention. I know sometimes the Supreme Court stuff is really in the weeds. We cover, and I know I can feel people zing out and tuning out when we cover it, but I hope people pay attention to the history of birthright citizenship and pay attention to what happens with the Supreme Court piece here. That is a fundamental piece of our democracy that we haven't had enough time to talk about today or period. Here. And then, just in honor of the passing of Reverend Jesse Jackson, I'm looking for activists and organizers, candidates and elected officials who are clear-eyed, without any cynicism, embracing the future of coalition politics. I am absolutely sick of the ways in which right-wing politics have dismantled the solidarity ethos of too much progressivism in the United States. I'm sickened by the anti-immigration and elements in the Black community. I'm sickened by the anti-immigration elements in communities of color. What Eileen is talking about, that neighborhood in Queens, right? That stuff to me is the consequences of what will ultimately be a deadly ideology for this democracy. So I'm looking to report on platform and talk to the activists, the organizers, the elected officials, and the candidates who have a clear-eyed, without any cynicism, embrace of solidarity and coalition building in terms of a political strategy. It's not the past. Jesse Jackson's passing might make you think it's the past. I believe it's the future for us. And so I'm on a hunt for that. And I know my colleagues here are as well.
Well, first, thank you, everyone. I think this was such a great, engaging conversation. As everyone touched on, this is just scraping the surface, but I did put it in the chat, but I want everyone to please make an effort to follow these different outlets. We have Sahan Journal, we have Documented, WURD Radio, and LA Public Press, and all of those you can find on URL Media. A little subtle plug, our website is url-media.com, so please check it out. This is just a snapshot of all the different newsrooms that represent our network and are doing this kind of work. This is literally just 4 of amazing outlets across this network. And it was hard to pick who to talk to because there is so much work being done in this space. So I thank all of you all for your time and thank you all for joining. And it sounds like we will be doing a birthright citizenship talk, definitely probably in May. So keep your calendars close. But thank you all again. And we hope to do this again soon.